A Concise History of Japan, page 26, chapter 2, The Courtly Age, 710 to 1185. Pause, pause, pause. With the emergence of the Yamato state and the advent of its imperial line, Japan entered the Nara, 710 to 94, and Heian periods, 794 to 1185. The fledgling imperial regime's history shares much in common with other nascent monarchies around the world. Frontier war and conquest, implementation of judicial and administrative bureaucracies, capital planning, elite monopolization of surplus, and the flowering of a rarefied court culture. In Japan, this courtly age served as the domain of the fictional prince Genji, a literary creation of writer Murasaki Shikibu, 978 to 2014. A fictional master of its artful age, Princess Genji writes exquisitely learned poetry, romances such tragic beauties as Yugao, Evening Face, croons with acquaintances about singing warbles and chirping insects, and moves through the social intricacies of the Heian court with dexterous grace. His mood is perennially sensitive and melancholic, always touched by the sadness of this fleeting world, a Buddhist aesthetic inspired by the transience of things. Importantly, the natural aesthetic of the Heian period, particularly as preserved in poetry, shaped enduring Japanese attitudes towards the natural world. The development of Japan's courtly age began with the Nara court's conquest of the Emishi, a tribe of hunter-gatherers in the northeastern section of the archipelago, people largely removed from the Chinese-inspired changes that had swept Japan since the 4th century. They are best described as Yomon remnants, people who stood outside the Ritsuryu panel administrative codes that incrementally defined life in Japan's core provinces by the 7th century. The Nara court constructed an elaborate Buddhist theocracy and Chinese-style administrative bureaucracy, which it relied upon for managing the affairs of state. The heavenly sovereigns, following their earlier Yamato trajectory, developed into chief priests and imperial living gods, who shared, at least in the pages of the Kojiki, Records of Ancient Matter 712, divine ancestors with the sun goddess. The Kojiki brushes over genealogical discontinuities among Japan's emperors, which was its principal purpose in narrating the land's creation myth. Other 8th century sources, such as the Nihon Shoki, Chronicles of Japan 720, resemble Chinese dynastic histories, drafting a record of events from the advent of the Yamato emperors forward. Dynastic genealogies proved important because they, along with the Ritsuryu codes, cemented and legitimized political power. By the end of the 8th century, Heian culture had become an amalgam of elements from Buddhist theocracy and Ritsuryu governance. Emishi and their Yamato rivals. Pause, pause, pause. The advent of the Yamato state was anything but uniform because not all early Yomon foragers yielded to the gravitational pull of East Asian sensibilities, nor did they buckle under the better fed Yayoi settlers who carried those ideas to the archipelago. Two distinct civilizations emerged in these formative years, ushering in an age of courtly conquest that occurred over the 7th century and shaped Japanese identity in striking ways. Though much is made of the myth of Japanese homogeneity, the country was, as we shall see, forged in the fires of cultural difference and imperial conquest. On the archipelago, competing histories complicate the rise of Japanese rule because a northern cultural sphere existed outside the Yamato imperial base, one that waged armed resistance to the changes that swept the Kinai region. The northern sphere did not immediately embrace Buddhism, Confucianism, dynastic history, Ritsuryu bureaucracy, and generally speaking, Chinese-style statehood. In the northeast, what archaeologists call the Epe-Yomon, 300 to 700 after Christus, people resisted the centripetal pull of Chinese-style governance and continued their foraging and hunting lifestyles into the 11th century. China did not shape their cultural milieu as it had for Yayoi migrants and Yamato kings. Rather, other people to the north did, such as the Satsumon and Okhotsk cultures of Hokkaido, as well as more distant people on the Sakhalin Island and even in the Amur River estuary. These distant people, not the celebrated Tang dynasty 618 to 907 of China, shaped life rhythms in the northern sphere. In court documents and histories, Nara and Heian officials labeled these Epayomon remnants the Emishi, a pejorative name meaning something like toad barbarians, and mobilized to conquer them with military campaigns in the 8th century. It is important to point out that other clans had resisted Yamato ascendancy, such as the Tsuchigumo, Kutsu, and Hayato, but the Yamato labeled none with the derogatory title of barbarian. They, to a certain degree, participated in the East Asian order, but simply rejected Yamato supremacy within it. Theirs was a political rather than civilizational affair. There was something completely different about the Emishi. They repudiated something bigger and more structural. When in 659 the Yamato court dispatched envoys to Emperor Gaozong (628–83), an Emishi couple accompanied the entourage as curiosities. Interested in them, the Chinese emperor inquired about their origins. The envoys explained that they came from the land of the Emishi in the northeast. They had no settled villages, and that they foraged and hunted. Elsewhere we learn that they spoke a barbarian language, suggesting that the Emishi were distinct Epayomon remnants that had, through remoteness, evasion, or force, avoided the waves of East Asian culture, starting with the Yoi agriculture that had swept north from Kyushu and into the Kinai region. The price for repudiating the Ritsuyo codes, however, was conquest. The vigorousness of the Nara subjugation of the Emishi testifies to the notion that partial compliance with the East Asian order was out of the question. In the Nara period, the northernmost military outpost was Fort Taiga, near Sendai, erected sometime around 724 and raised in 780 by Emishi fighters. Its mission was to subdue and then order Emishi villages according to the new Ritsuryu logic. Its commander was the Shinju shogun, or peacekeeper general, the earliest predecessor of later samurai shoguns who ruled in the medieval and early modern years. Between 701 and 798, essentially the whole duration of the Nara period, 14 generals served in this capacity. Nara and early Heian officials constructed other forts, such as Akita and Okachi, both in Akita Prefecture. Emishi resistance was tenacious in these areas, however, and the military campaigns often proved cruel and indecisive. Only with the ascendancy of Emperor Kanmu (737–806) in the closing years of the 8th century, and the relocation of the capital from Nara to Kyoto, did Kinai leaders redouble their efforts against the Emishi in what is called the 38 Years' War (773–811). In preparation, generals built up food and weapon stockpiles at Taga. In 789, however, Emishi fighters routed the newly fortified Kinai forces north of the Koromo River. Not deterred, in 800, after the Heian transition, the court dispatched a newly appointed general, Sakonoe no Tamuramaro (758–811). A courtly warrior with ties to the emperor, proved military triumphant after vanquishing Emishi fighters and beheading the Emishi general Atorii in 802. He constructed several additional forts, and the Emishi Wars came to a close in 805. Though the Emishi Wars ended at the dawn of the 9th century, the northern sphere retained a blended frontier flavor. Northeastern Japan marched to a different set of cultural drummers. Even as late as the 11th century, prominent northeastern families such as the Hiraizumi Fujiwara retained many Emishi idiosyncrasies, such as ritual mummification at death, unknown among Japanese, but practiced among groups on Sakhalin Island at their luxuriant Konjikido pavilion. In the medieval years, the region became famous for its horse farms, also indicative of earlier connections to the northern sphere. Other historical legacies of the Emishi conflict include the advent of Ainu culture in the 12th century and the emergence of the samurai. Those peacekeepers had fought in the Emishi Wars and settled in the hinterlands, and would eventually usurp Heian court governance and rule the country for centuries through a series of Bakufu shogunal governance. Nara and the theocratic court. Rather than view the Emishi Wars as something new, an invigorated Nara court waging frontier wars against an emergent Emishi enemy, Historians need to view them as the bloody conclusion of the unfinished business of state formation. Indeed, the conflict surrounding Yayoi migration and dispersal, and Chinese documentation of the chaos that accompanied Yamato ascendancy, only concluded with the Heian court beheading Emishi generals. In Japan, the implementation of an East Asian order required centuries of skull-cracking because such regimes functioned poorly with only partial compliance. In 710, when the Emishi Wars had heated up, the Yamato capital was moved to Nara, or Heiji-kyo, where an elaborate court evolved. As emphasized, the Emishi Wars were an extension of the strengthening of courtly rule at Nara, a ripple effect caused by the waves of bureaucratic logic sweeping the archipelago. Modeled after China's Tang capital of Chang'an, Nara became a spatial dramatization of the Ritsuyo's geomantic order, court power, and theocratic authority. Just as in the court bureaucracy, where proximity to the emperor meant political power, so too did geographic proximity to the imperial palace signal power. At the center of Nara's theocratic order was the Todaji's Great Eastern Temple, built on the outskirts of Nara between 728 and 752. Just as keyhole-shaped tombs had, to a certain degree, homogenized burial rituals under earlier Yamato kings, the Todaji temple served as the hub in a network of Buddhist temples erected in the provinces. Though the giant statue of the Vairocana Buddha housed in the temple exhausted the realm's supply of bronze, it came to symbolize the theocratic union between the Nara court and Buddhism. Emperor Shomu, 701–56, who initiated Todaji's construction, saw in the enormous temple the promise that the entire land may be joined with us in the fellowship of Buddhism and enjoy in common the advantages which this undertaking affords to the attainment of Buddhahood. To step back one moment, the development of a Buddhist theocracy was far from a foregone conclusion. Even though Empress Suko, 554–628, had patronized the Indian religion, Buddhism had a slow start after its initial importation in 552. As the Nihon Shoki explains, when envoys of the Korean Paekje king presented a statue of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni and sutras and other artifacts, they explained, "This doctrine is amongst all doctrines the most excellent, but it is hard to explain and hard to comprehend. This doctrine can create religious merit and retribution without measure and without bounds, and so lead on to a full appreciation of the highest wisdom. Imagine a man in possession of treasures to his heart's content, so that he might satisfy all his wishes in proportion as he used them." With such a billing, it is hardly surprising that Buddhism, with its promise of treasure, wisdom, and power, became integrated into Yamato life. With the outbreak of plague after its importation, however, the introduction of the new faith clearly required care. Shortly after the introduction of Buddhism, a pestilence was rife in the land from which the people died prematurely. As time went on, it became worse and worse, and there was no remedy. On advice of the Nakatomi and Mononobe families, the emperor ordered that the statue be discarded in the currents of Canal of Naniya, and that the temple be burned to the ground. Imperial advisors thought that the statue had offended the native sun goddess, mythic ancestor of the Yamato emperors. After the bronze statue of the Buddha was discarded, however, a sudden conflagration consumed the great hall of the palace. The court found itself in the unfortunate position of being wedged between two jealous gods. The Nakatomi and the Mononobe families continued to oppose Buddha worship, despite the smoldering cinders at the great hall of the palace. Only the Soga family sought to worship the Buddha, particularly under the patronage of Soga no Umako, 551–626. His niece was the tenacious Tsuko. From this point forward, under Soga's patronage, Buddhism found a secure foothold in court politics and eventually the religious traditions of Japan. We turn to the intricacies of Buddhism later in this book, as many competing sects require separate treatment.